us off with Ahsan Zahid, who will be talking about linting for beginners. He's a software engineer who works in San Francisco. He's particularly interested in healthcare tech and ed tech. He believes that one of the best things about tech is that it can save you time, whether that's automating menial work or not having to dig through your code for the one misspelled variable name. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ahsan.
Woo! All right. All right, my name's Ahsan, and let's start. So, it is on sheep, it is in belly buttons, it is on sweaters, and perhaps it will be in your code. I'm here today to talk to you about lint, more specifically, a guide to linting for beginners. So let's go with some background. So, linting refers to static code analysis. Originally, lint was a C program written by this guy named Stephen C. Johnson when he worked at Bell Labs, primarily for Unix. He explained his motivation and kind of how things are supposed to work in a paper in 1978, so that's an approximation of about when it came out. What this does is it parses an abstract syntax tree generated from your code. So it parses your code without actually running it. And it checks that code against a set of rules. So you have rules predefined for what your code is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to do, things you can figure out about the code without actually running it. So you're not worried about actually having to, if there's a loop that runs 1,000,000 times, you're not actually running it 1,000,000 times, but you're still checking what that code does. So you can check it more strictly than a compiler can, oftentimes, for syntax and consistency and style. So today, programs that are like lint are called linters, or we just call them lint for whatever language, and they exist for just about any language you can think of. So why do we use lint? Mainly for good code and less debugging. So lint offers you decreased debugging, less looking for logical loopholes, more carving out cruft or dead code, and reducing runtime errors. It's especially useful for interpreted languages like Python or JavaScript, where you don't actually have a compilation step. So the only way to find a lot of errors would be to write your code, run it, find the error, and then try it again, run it again. So lint helps a lot. And for big teams, when you have a really huge code base, one of the prime uses for lint is that it gives you a lot of consistency. It lets all the code across the code base look similar enough so that you can do things like searches and things, and you'll actually have a consistent code base, even if there are hundreds of people working on it. So uses for lint, a lot of the stuff you might already be used to using something like Visual Studio, because it does a lot of the stuff for you. So you can do things like detect unused variables or functions, find uses of undeclared variables, so variables you're using that haven't been set yet that might cause errors later, code that's unreachable or dead, and you can enforce different rules, for example, matching arguments and parameters, checking whether you're using your imports and whether your imports even really exist, checking for types and typecasting. So it does a lot of these things for you. Much like Microsoft Word, it gives you a little chevron underneath your code, and it tells you what the problem is. Depending on what editor you're using, VS Code has Pylint built in, and it actually gives you tons of info on what the error is and how you might go about fixing it. It does a lot of style checking. So style checking are things where your code runs, it might work fine, but it might look very bad and not be very consistent with the rest of the code base. So things like enforcing a max line length to try to make sure your code is very concise, consistent indentation across code, making sure that you have the right amount of line breaks or white space, whatever that might be for your project or for your company. And if you have lots of users with the same lint rules, the code should look about the same no matter who wrote it. So that's one of the prime uses for it. So installing a linter in Python is pretty nice. There are a few prominent linters. Flake8 is one. There's Pylint. Flake8 is built on top of PyFlakes and pep8. Installing it is simple enough. You just do sudo pip install flake8. And to use it on the command line, you just run flake8 with a folder name, and it'll analyze it with the default rules or custom ones that you've set up. And it'll tell you all the problems you have in your code and where they are in terms of line, character, etc. If you're using an editor, oftentimes it'll do this in real time. So for example, in VS Code, and for Sublime and stuff, if you install it, every time you save, it'll run a lint check. So you're continuously seeing where your problems might be without having to run your code. So that can end up saving you quite a bit of time, especially if you have problems where, for example, you messed up on one variable name and one of the 500 uses of it, and you capitalized something in the middle. So lint can help check that so you're not like digging through your code for hours and hours trying to find it. Several editors have prominent plugins for it. VS Code has Pylint built in. There's linter Pylint for Atom. There's one for Vim, Sublime. Basically anything that you might use, there's probably a linter for it. Last couple things, linters are configurable. So there's usually a default set of rules. In Python, there are times there's like style guides and like pep8, so there's a lot of those are used. You can write custom lint rules as well. So whatever you can do by parsing an abstract syntax tree, and you can do a lot of it, you can write a plugin that examines the code and decides what to do with it, whether that code is like okay. Perhaps you want to find all instances of a certain function and make sure that like when you run one function, the next function should be a very particular one. So you can write things like that. And even if you don't want to write a custom lint utility or a plugin for whatever linter you're using, you can also write little custom code like this that literally just brute forces and checks code. And this is often very useful for small things. So that's about all. Hope you guys have a great 2018 full of very clean code. And thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Ahsan. I said it right this time, right?